Hi folks, we are out today exploring one of the Simcoe County forests. So Simcoe County is an area in central Ontario, Canada, and they've preserved over 150 forest areas that cover 330,000 acres of protected forest land that the public, anyone in Canada is free to use, come out and use for free. So you can come here and hike, bike, no camping, it's only day use, but all these areas are protected and preserved for everyday use. So just further on from that, I was going to be sharing a story today of a man and his gang that existed in this area of Simcoe County, which is now known as the township of Oro-Medonte. Back in the day, they were called the Black Swamp Gang. And so please come along with me and I'll share the story of the Black Swamp Gang with you and why their leader was known as the Terror of Simcoe. So on our walk we found an old foundation here behind me. I have no idea what it belonged to, but it may have been early settlers in this area. So back to my story about the Black Swamp Gang. So not far from here there was a swamp. It was a very dark, very crowded forest apparently, and it was known as Black's Swamp. And so this gang, when they started up, they wanted somewhere to hide out. And so they kind of set up their headquarters in this area known as Black Swamp. So they became known as the Black Swamp Gang. So their leader was a fellow from Scotland. His family had immigrated here to Canada, and they had started up a farm in this area, and they had, you know, kind of meeked out an meager existence as farmers here. You know, they had enough to eat and they were taken care of, but you know, they were happy with what they had. But not Sandy McDuff, one of their sons. He wanted more and he didn't want to work for it. And so he started up a gang. He didn't want to be a farmer. And so he got together about as many as 25 local thugs, and they started up the Black Swamp Gang and terrorized this area. So I'll tell you a little bit more about him as we hike along. Another old stone foundation. So back to my story about Sandy McDuff. He became known as Big Sandy McDuff, the Terror of Simcoe. He was a tall, athletic man, apparently over 6 feet tall, which was unusual for men of the day. He was Scottish descent and a local of Oro Township. So the gang started by stealing local crops, livestock, and money. The locals were afraid to report him, and as his reputation grew, he would demand free whiskey from the local drinking establishments, which would fuel his violent streaks and need to wreak destruction. On one occasion, Big Sandy McDuff and some of his gang members demanded a ride from a local who had a wagon and some horses. Well, Sandy wasn't too fond of the locals' driving ability, and so him and his gang members beat the poor man senseless, left him on the side of the road for dead, and stole his wagon and horses. The local police would form militias or posses to round up Big Sandy McDuff and his gang members, but they would always turn back out of fear of being beaten and ran off by Big Sandy and his gang. It is a hot one today here in central Ontario. It's about 32 degrees, so it's very nice to be in the forest here. But back to the story about the Terror of Simcoe and the Black Swamp Gang. So as their notoriety grew, so too did the fear of the local residents and the innkeepers and the tavern keepers. So much so that some of the tavern keepers would try to sell their business, only no one would want to buy it because they all knew about the Black Swamp Gang and the terror and mayhem and destruction that they would bring upon their establishments. So unfortunately, they were all just made to put up with Sandy McDuff and his gang when they would come around and demand whiskey and free food. And then of course, the more they drank, the more violent they got. And they would end up breaking tables and chairs and windows out of these poor innkeepers' buildings. So check out the size of this maple tree. This very well could have been around when Sandy McDuff was causing terror in this area of Simcoe County. So the Black Swamp Gang were prolific in this area from the township of Oro-Medonte, or what was used to be known as Oro, over to Coldwater, the village of Coldwater, and into Orillia as well. This was back in the 1860s to the 1880s. On one occasion, Big Sandy and some of his gang members decided they'd have a night out in Orillia. They wanted to go to one of the local drinking establishments. So they helped themselves to a wagon and some horses, and they proceeded on into Orillia to one of the taverns. Now, Sandy and his gang, although Sandy was Scottish, much of his gang were Orangemen. They were Irish Protestants. Well, little did they know, they would meet up with the Mara gang, one of the gangs from outside of Orillia, who were mostly Catholic. So the two, of course, got into a fight. Total of 7 shots were fired inside the tavern. Amazingly, no one was killed, but a couple of them did receive, I believe, leg injuries. So yeah, that was the Orillia Tavern Shootout between the Black Swamp Gang and the Mara Gang, or the Irish Orangemen and the Irish Catholics from the Mara Gang. For a time, Simcoe County had a reprieve from the terror of Sandy McDuff and his Black Swamp Gang. They had heard that there was big money to be made down south of the border in the lumber camps. So they proceeded down to Michigan to work at the lumber camps for about 4 years, and all was quiet. But eventually Sandy returned to his old stomping grounds to wreak his old brand of havoc. Now, rumor has it that he was fleeing prosecution south of the border for murder charges. So he very quickly took up his old habits of stealing, drinking, fighting, and causing terror in this area of Simcoe County. Well, it's a lovely day to be out for a walk in the woods, even though it is pretty hot. Being in the forest, it definitely makes it feel slightly cooler. I hope you're enjoying the story of Sandy McDuff. I'm sure every area that you visit has some sort of a legend or story to it like this. Always interesting to learn about your local area or the areas that you're visiting. So just to tell you a little bit more about Simcoe County Forest areas, they were the brainchild, I believe, of one of our members of Parliament. I can't recall his first name, but I believe his last name was Drury. And so back in the day, there's so much logging that happened in Simcoe County that all of the ground underneath was very much sandy, a sandy composition. And apparently it was just like a dust bowl up here. They'd actually have to plow the sand off of the roads. And so Mr. Drury had the idea that he would set aside these tracts of land, and they would you know, plant trees on them and try to reestablish them to try to cut down on some of this sand and the dust bowl that Simcoe County was becoming. So they're great now for residents to come out and enjoy the natural landscape around them. And so you just see from the sign behind me some of the things that they allow and don't allow. So in hunting season, they do allow hunting in most of the Simcoe County Forest, so you do have to keep that in mind if it is hunting season, to take proper precautions and to be you know, well marked with orange vests. You know, better to be safe than sorry. So here's a little memorial to the man who was instrumental in creating Simcoe County Forests. Honorable E.C. Drury, born in Oro, and was the Premier of Ontario from 1919 to 1923. I was trying to think of what we could have for a snack that Sandy McDuff might have eaten when he was out in the forest trying to escape law enforcement. Chances are he was probably in a tavern, though, demanding free whiskey and food. Anyway, what I came up with, though, was some pancetta, diced pancetta, and some red onions, and hash browns. I figured they'd probably have some sort of maybe cured meat and potatoes, of course, and onions. So we're gonna fry this up for a little snack and eat it out here in the bush, just like outlaws. What I'm making here is more or less kind of like a potato hash. It's a great idea too if you have like leftover potatoes, say you've had a roast with some carrots and potatoes and some other vegetables, and just throw it all in the frying pan together. Makes a great little meal. So back to my story about Sandy McDuff. So he was finally brought in by one of the local law enforcement officials after assaulting an innkeeper who he believed had been telling the local news about all of his misdeeds. And Sandy sought him out and beat him and kicked him nearly senseless one night, broke several of his ribs. And so local law enforcement made up a posse, and they sought to bring in Sandy McDuff. So Sandy was finally tried and convicted of assaulting this poor man, and he was sentenced to prison in Toronto, Ontario, for 1 year. Okay, well, I think our little snack here in the woods is done. So we're going to eat this and then continue on our hike. Okay, so back to my story about Big Sandy McDuff. We've finished our snack of the pancetta and hash browns and fried onion. That was quite good. So Sandy spent a year in prison for assaulting the poor innkeeper who he believed was reporting on him to the local news. And by the way, Big Sandy's defense tried to argue that it was the innkeeper's fault for serving him the whiskey that made him so drunk that he beat him in the first place. So he served his year in the Toronto Penitentiary and was released, and no one really knows what became of Big Sandy McDuff after that. Some say that he went south of the border again, possibly New York or as far down as Mexico. Some say that he was killed in a bar fight, and others say they believe that his ghost still haunts this area of Simcoe County, still trying to wreak his terror and havoc on the locals that still live here. So if you're ever in this part of Ontario and you're out walking in the woods and perhaps you hear a branch break behind you, just think of the story of Big Sandy McDuff, the Terror of Simcoe, because he may be watching you. Well, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Lori Explores, something, again, a little different. So if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, there's always all kinds of legends and stories of people in different areas that you can share, some sort of, you know, local legends. So again, thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring.